Yamashita's gold is one of the greatest treasure hoards ever known.
In today's currency, it represents over $100 billion in value.
According to the myth, this incredible fortune was the proceeds of ruthless Japanese looting throughout Asia during World War II. For one amateur treasure hunter, finding the gold became a lifelong obsession.
If he had to get down on his hands and knees and dig with his fingers until they bled, I see him being that kind of man.
But little did he know, he had a mighty rival, one of the most brutal dictators of the 20th century.
Marcos was unquestionably a thug. He was a gangster.
Just when this penniless Filipino had riches beyond his wildest dreams within his grasp, his quest turned into a nightmare.
He's put a target on his back.
This is the extraordinary story of Roger Rojas.
He was willing to be David against Goliath.
Roger was a hero.
And the legend of Yamashita's gold. In May 1970, amateur treasure hunter Roger Rojas was combing the jungles around his hometown of Baguio in the northern Philippines. For over a decade, he'd spent every spare moment searching for a long-lost hoard of treasure. He'd put all his money into his quest. Unless he found it, he faced ruin. Then, after weeks of back-breaking work, at last, Roger spotted something. Had he finally found what he'd been looking for his entire life? Had he found Yamashita's gold? The legend of Yamashita's gold is one of the greatest stories of war loot in history. By 1942, the Japanese Imperial Army had successfully invaded all of Southeast Asia. As they advanced, they mercilessly ransacked country after country. They stole on a massive scale, reportedly unrivaled in military history.
Yamashita's gold is wealth beyond belief. People wouldn't believe how much it is. $1 trillion worth. So it's a mind-blowing amount.
The mastermind heading this covert operation, codenamed the Golden Lily, was said to be Prince Chichibu, the emperor's brother.
This guy is brilliant. Prince Chichibu was a perfect choice to head up the Golden Lily because he wasn't just a military man, he was an Oxford scholar, and he brought an incredible amount of creativity and lateral thinking to how we'll go about this complex process of looting.
The Golden Lily operatives just completely took everything from all the countries. They left them with nothing. They invaded, they took all their wealth, and just left them penniless.
It wasn't just banks and financial institutions, but it also had museums, temples, art galleries, rare books, anything that was worth money. They knew about it, knew where it was, how much it was worth, and they took it. The Golden Lily's looting was so comprehensive, they even targeted the underworld, the gangster world, the black markets, and they absolutely drained them of anything that was of value.
Having amassed treasures of all shapes and sizes, the Golden Lily's mission was far from over. They needed to get it back home, to Japan. First, they melted the gold into easy-to-move ingots. But this smelting also served a shadier purpose.
When gold is made, it's stamped, and you can tell where it came from. But when it's been resmelted, you don't know where it came from. So he wanted to stamp the little sign on the gold bars that the gold was actually made in Japan. Then it would look like the gold was Japanese gold of Japanese origin.
This stolen gold was then brought to the Philippines. There it was inventoried and then sent on to Japan by ship.
The Philippines was chosen as the Golden Lily's transportation hub because it was pretty much in the center of the vast Japanese empire.
For the first year of operations, the Golden Lily's transportation network ran like clockwork. But then, the tide of the war turned. In June 1942, Japanese and US forces met near the tiny Pacific island of Midway. Over just 4 days, the US forces sank 5 Japanese ships. They destroyed 270 aircraft and killed 3,500 men. The Japanese had lost control of the seas. Now it was too risky for them to ship the gold home. They needed a new plan. They turned to their finest fighting general, Tomoyuki Yamashita.
He has an incredible track record. Nobody has the reputation he does, and if anyone can pull one out of the hat, it would be him.
Yamashita made his name when he caused the greatest humiliation of the British Army in its history. In December 1941, he invaded Malaya, sweeping down the peninsula in only a matter of weeks. Yamashita then captured the British military stronghold of Singapore.
Hitherto, both Malaya and Singapore had been thought to be completely unassailable, that the British were totally in charge militarily, and he proved them wrong. He made the British capitulate, and it was the biggest capitulation of the British Army in British military history.
Virtually overnight, Yamashita took nearly 100,000 Allied soldiers prisoner. His victory sent shockwaves across the world and earned Yamashita his fearsome nickname, the Tiger of Malaya.
なくば全軍に命じて猛攻撃を開始する。それでも良いかと詰め寄る。
With the gold now stuck in the Philippines, Yamashita was being asked to come up with another miracle. The story goes, he was told to hide the gold until it was safe to move it. He identified 175 suitable burial sites across the Philippines. They would hold the gold until the Japanese were once again victorious. And the Philippines proved the ideal place to hide this treasure.
They put it in very isolated parts throughout the Philippines, mostly covered by very mountainous terrain and a thick, thick jungle. Once you got these tunnels built, it would become virtually impossible to see that there had been anything ever buried there because of the growth rate in the jungle.
It said Yamashita ordered detailed maps to be made of the exact location of each treasure vault. And each map was carefully encoded.
These maps were done in an old Japanese dialect called kanji, a language which is between 1,500 and 2,000 years old, and there were no topographical references on them. They used the old characters to represent certain landmarks.
Unless you knew the complex code, these maps were meaningless. And there were even further layers of security.
Bombs, grenades, decoy walls that would lead you into another trap.
The Golden Lily left nothing to chance, and they had a vast system of booby traps that consisted of poisonous gas, explosives, complex use of the water table, so if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to drown in your pursuit of reaching the treasures.
But the maps that were drawn highlighted where all those traps were. If you didn't have a map and you went into one of these treasure vaults, it's very likely that you wouldn't come out alive.
And to ensure all the treasure vault locations remained top secret, the number of people in the know was ruthlessly kept to a minimum.
They used prisoner of war or local slave labor to build the actual treasure vaults. And the people who are building it don't know why, but that's irrelevant. They're gonna die anyway. So they're usually killed, shot on the spot.
But for all Yamashita's efforts, the gold still wasn't safe. In October 1944, the Americans landed in the Philippines. The fighting that followed was the bloodiest of the Pacific War.
The fighting in the Philippines at the end of the war was extremely brutal.
Yamashita would fight to the very last man for the emperor.
But even a master tactician like Yamashita couldn't stop the Americans' advance.
The Philippines has 7,000 plus islands and is very, very difficult to defend against an invading force. Yamashita, as a great general, would have known that.
Yamashita faced a crisis. He knew he couldn't hold the Philippines. All he could do was drag out the fight for as long as possible. And it seemed there was one particular reason Yamashita needed to buy himself time. He still hadn't finished burying the gold.
Golden Lily are running out of time and desperate. So they've got these ships in the harbor with gold that they need to get into the tunnels. They have no time. What do? They scuttle them and sink them.
April 1945. Yamashita had been forced to retreat back to the mountains around the northern city of Baguio.
Their systematic hiding of their national treasure becomes less systematic and more panicked. They need to do it immediately because they're about to suffer defeat. 174 treasure vaults done and dusted. Only one is left.
With time running out, Yamashita ordered the chief engineers to seal the final treasure vault.
These engineers knew everything. They knew how the maps were made. They knew where the burial sites were. They knew how they were booby-trapped.
What they didn't know was Yamashita had one last move to protect the gold. The story goes that while the engineers were carrying out his orders, Yamashita sealed the vault the engineers were still inside. Now, they would be its guardians for eternity. Three months later, World War II was over. General Yamashita was put on trial for war crimes.
Did you at any time issue any orders directing the killing of non-combatant citizens?
Absolutely not. Anything
The trial lasted just over 5 weeks.
The commission finds you guilty as charged and sentences you to death by hanging.
Yamashita took the secrets of the gold to his grave. There was only one other person who allegedly knew of the gold's whereabouts: Prince Chichibu. And in 1953, he died of TB.
Anybody who knew anything about this treasure is now dead.
It seemed Yamashita's gold was lost forever. But in the Philippines, after the horrors of war, the legend of Yamashita's gold lived on.
There were lots and lots of rumors that the Japanese had buried treasure all over the Philippines.
It's almost a national obsession. Everybody across the country is aware of it, and everyone's looking for it.
Among those who'd grown up with stories about the gold was a young Filipino locksmith. Rogelio Rojas, better known as Roger, was born in 1943, just as Yamashita's gold was being buried.
Roger's childhood was really difficult. The Philippines are extremely impoverished. His family is impoverished.
Roger was one of millions of Filipinos growing up in the shadow of World War II.
The war had devastated the Philippines. Manila was absolutely on its knees in a way that no other city in the whole of the Second World War, other than Warsaw. It was dreadful. Hundreds of thousands killed, families broken up, desperate poverty, no real economy going. It was in a really bad state.
So it was no surprise that the legend of Yamashita's gold just took Roger by heart at a very young age. Someone that poor with a possibility of obtaining wealth beyond your wildest dreams, of course you're going to go for it.
Roger the locksmith lived in Baguio, the northern city, near to where Yamashita made his last stand.
Roger surmises that they must have hid some of the treasure around his town. So he looks around his town right from the start, because he knows logically that's probably one of the best places to start.
Roger was a very diligent man. Every spare moment he was out there working, seeing what he could find, eliminating areas, and continuing to move forward in a very logical, progressive manner.
To help him in his quest, Roger scrimped and saved and bought himself a metal detector. Yet all Roger had ever managed to find were a few old coins and some Japanese ammunition. But that didn't shake his faith. One day he was sure he would come across the treasure he'd been dreaming of since he was a boy.
No matter how many disappointments a treasure hunter has, they will always keep going.
Then, in 1961, after years of hunting the gold with just youthful optimism, Roger had what seemed to be a breakthrough. He got the kind of clue he'd been longing for, a map of a tunnel complex. There were lots of maps and sketches like this in treasure hunting circles at the time. Roger had seen plenty of them before, but all had been fakes. This one was different. This map had come from a Japanese soldier.
He's convinced that this is the real deal.
Trouble was, the map was in the Golden Lily's fiendishly complex code.
It's a needle in a haystack, and you don't even know where the haystack is because the map has no topographical features.
But Roger also knew that this Japanese soldier had been in Baguio with a group of engineers as they buried gold during the final days of Yamashita's retreat. The map allegedly related to one of those treasure vaults.
It was getting closer. He could feel it.
Roger never gives up. And the reason is he knows the treasure is there. And he knows that year after year, if nothing else, he's eliminating where it isn't.
Yet for all his high hopes, Roger just couldn't crack the map's code. And so, even after looking for several more years, he was still no closer to finding Yamashita's gold. But at least the map confirmed to Roger his first instincts were right. There had to be treasure somewhere around Baguio.
He knows it's there. This is not a myth. This is historical fact.
Then Roger met a man who seemed to offer him his next breakthrough, Eusebio Okubo. Okubo told Roger he had served under the Japanese as an interpreter during their occupation of the Philippines.
There were a lot of Filipinos who claimed to know where Japanese buried treasure was, mainly because an awful lot of Filipinos had, perforce, worked with the Japanese, not necessarily what we would call collaborators, but simply because the Japanese needed cooks, drivers, interpreters, all that sort of thing.
When Roger met Okubo, he would have had mixed feelings. Here's somebody who colluded with the enemy.
Okubo confessed he had served none other than General Yamashita. While working for him, Okubo had witnessed Yamashita taking a large quantity of gold to Baguio towards the very end of the war. And then, Okubo revealed the crucial piece of information Roger was after. This gold was in wooden boxes, stashed in a tunnel not far from Baguio General Hospital.
So this was the final link. This allowed him to tie the bow together and have the perfect package. Now he knows where to go, he knows where to dig. He was elated because it now pinpointed the area for him to look at.
But little did Roger know, he had a rival. The most powerful man in the Philippines, President Ferdinand Marcos. In 1965, Marcos had been democratically elected. But he rapidly became a pathologically greedy dictator.
Money was extremely important to Ferdinand Marcos. He loved it like nothing else.
And there was only one person who could match Marcos's greed. His shopaholic wife, Imelda.
Marcos wooed Imelda, it is said, by taking her down to the vault beneath his bank and just showing her enormous great stacks of $100 bills. Whether or not this is true or not, I don't know, but it's extremely likely. And I should think it almost certainly would have convinced her that she was onto a good thing.
But Imelda's lavish lifestyle wasn't the only reason Marcos needed money.
The richer you were, the more powerful you were. It's that simple. It's a very simple equation.
And nothing could make Marcos more powerful than finding Yamashita's gold.
It's not at all surprising that Marcos was interested in Yamashita's gold because he was a thug, basically, and the mere thought of the promise of gold, and he would have been onto it like a shot.
Compared to Roger, Marcos had a serious advantage in the hunt for Yamashita's gold. Power.
It was incredibly easy for Marcos to use his power to find the gold. He has entire armies at his disposal. Armies, ships, experts on maps and deciphering all sorts of clues.
Despite all these resources, Marcos hadn't found anything, and so he devised a shrewd strategy.
He was a brilliant politician, but he was also brilliantly corrupt. On the surface, he seemed to be a rational person, going by the law, by the books, but in person, he was quite ruthless.
Marcos passed a law demanding treasure hunters apply for a permit, detailing where they were going to start digging.
He comes up with the permit system because this way he has all the enthusiastic treasure hunters all across the country working for him because they've now told him where they think the treasure is.
He's just waiting to see if anyone finds it, then he can move in because he has the resources to do that. And you know, that's very smart.
Meanwhile, back in Baguio, in 1970, Roger married. With a new wife and child on the way, he needed Yamashita's gold now more than ever. And so Roger dutifully applied for one of Marcos's permits.
Roger did everything the right way. He thought that if he followed the rules that had been put in place by the government, he would be able to search, he would be able to find and excavate and recover, and it would all be done with the blessings of the government.
In Roger's town, the person who manages the application is none other than Marcos's uncle.
In May 1970, armed with his permit, his map, and Akubo's information, Roger decided to risk everything to find Yamashita's gold. He spent all his life savings hiring a team of laborers. Together they started hacking their way through the thick jungle vegetation near Baguio General Hospital.
So it was really difficult for Roger to find the tunnel near the hospital because it was 25 years before that it was blasted shut. And every single year in the rainy season, these jungles, you know, they change their look and feel dramatically.
Then, after 2 weeks of almost non-stop searching, Roger spotted the mouth of a cave. Could this be the entrance to the treasure vault Akubo told him about? A 100 meters into the tunnel, a collapse meant Roger couldn't go any further. But for Roger, this was a good sign. He knew the Japanese had used dynamite to blast their treasure vaults shut. And so Roger and his crew began the arduous task of clearing the way.
The conditions for Roger and the team digging the tunnel would have been horrific. It was hot, there were insects, there were snakes. It was very, very hard work.
Digging the tunnel was very, very dangerous. And Roger knew that if this really was a tunnel that the Japanese had built, there may be booby traps.
But Roger was willing to risk his life to get to Yamashita's gold.
Once you get that gold fever, it is insatiable. You just cannot quench that appetite. He was becoming obsessed. One more spade, one more rock. I'm going to get it. This is going to be the treasure of a lifetime. And everybody's going to say, yes, you found it.
Finally, after 4 long months of digging, they broke through. It was then he made a grim discovery. Skeletons dressed in rags. But these weren't just any rags. They were Japanese military uniforms. Surely these were the remains of the engineers who had hidden Yamashita's gold, only to be buried alive by Yamashita himself.
He thinks he's there, and he knows now that he has all the pieces to the puzzle. He is literally at the threshold of the gold recovery that he has sought now for 10 years. It's there, it's within his fingertips' grasp.
Stretching beyond the skeletons was a vast network of tunnels. Roger and his team spent weeks exploring them. Day after day, they found nothing.
The next day, he was out there ready to go again. He knew it was there. He believed in his heart of hearts that that gold was there. He was going to go after it no matter what.
But a full 6 months on from finding the entrance to the tunnel, Roger still hadn't found any treasure.
Roger had spent all the money that he had raised to start the dig to begin with, and no one was going to give him any more money.
No money meant no crew. It seemed the hunt was over. Roger had squandered his life savings on a huge mistake. Just before Roger decided to give up once and for all, he had one last go with his metal detector. Then he heard its telltale buzz.
This buzz that Roger got from his metal detector must have been the best sound he'd ever heard in his life.
Roger was stunned. Hiding behind the wall was a gold statue of Buddha.
This was that moment in life that you would look back on and you say, yes, I have achieved my goal for my entire life. This is it. This find is the most significant find of anything that anybody had discovered in the Philippines.
The Buddha was in the Burmese style. According to the legend, the Japanese had looted religious artifacts from temples right across Burma. He really must have found one of Yamashita's 175 treasure vaults. And that wasn't all. The area around the Buddha was stacked full of wooden boxes. Finally, it was payday.
The gold that Roger has just discovered is worth a fortune. Each of those bars is worth $1,000, and he estimated there were over 1,000 boxes of the gold bars. So you're talking an incredible amount of money, more treasure than even he ever dreamed he would find. I mean, this has surpassed his wildest expectations.
Roger returned home with the Buddha, planning to go back for the gold with trucks and men. But the more he looked at the statue, the more curious Roger became. There was something about it that wasn't quite right. The Buddha was full of diamonds.
The value had just gone off the chart.
Roger, I mean, he's getting richer and richer by the minute. He has 1,000 boxes of gold bars, he has a gold Buddha, and now he has handfuls of diamonds.
That night, Roger documented his life-changing find. News of Roger's miraculous discovery soon spread to the presidential palace.
I can just imagine him going crazy when the word had gotten to him. Marcos was going to do anything to get that Buddha away from Rojas, and it was going to eventually sit in Marcos' palace.
Unfortunately for Roger, Marcos's primary tactic was brute force. On the 5th of April 1971, it's said a group of mysterious men turned up at Roger's house.
Rojas didn't answer the door.
You have to ask yourself, how would you feel if all of a sudden at 2:30 in the morning, there's loud banging and knocking on the door? I think he'd be panic-stricken, and I'm sure he was.
They said, "You have 3 minutes to open the door or we're going to shoot you right here." They took everything away from him.
Can you imagine the feeling of violation? His entire life, he's looked for this, he's found it, and now it's been taken.
But if Marcos thought he could intimidate Roger and his family, he was wrong.
Roger had risked everything to find this gold, and he wasn't going to let it go so easily.
Roger reported the theft to the police.
By that time, President Marcos had a considerable stranglehold on the police and the army particularly.
But Marcos did not yet control the media. Within days, the press picked up Roger's story.
It was a huge scandal. You know, there's stolen loot, it's World War II, it's the Japanese, it's Marcos being implicated.
The newspaper was full of articles that were nothing short of calling Marcos a common thief.
The hostile press coverage came at a critical time for Marcos.
He was widely known to have fixed his second term of office, the elections, which were ludicrously corrupt. I mean, he allegedly won by 2 million votes. It was just impossible. He was widely lampooned on all sides for corruption, and he was beginning to feel himself quite insecure.
Marcos needed to silence this treasure hunter fast. There was one obvious solution.
The Marcos regime was notorious for extrajudicial executions. You'd have death squads basically killing people who were seen as being very critical of the regime.
But this time, Marcos needed a different approach.
I think by that time he must have thought that the story had enough public exposure for him not to be able to risk just making Roger vanish, like a lot of his opponents.
3 weeks later, Roger at last received some good news. He was told his Buddha was waiting to be collected at the courthouse in Baguio. When he got there, he was in for a shock.
When Roger saw the Buddha, he knew immediately this wasn't the Buddha that he had found. It was a different color, different shape, facial expression. The head didn't come off.
Marcos is expecting Roger to say, yes, that's the Buddha, thank you.
But he didn't know Rojas. Rojas was determined. He wasn't going to let that boot up. And this was a huge mistake for Marcos because he had misread Rojas' personality.
Roger declared the Buddha was a fake.
I think that was completely reckless of him, because by that time he would have known that he was a marked man, and to cause that kind of fuss, effectively tackling Marcos himself at a personal level, would have been absolutely ridiculous and very stupid, in my view. However, he did it. He clearly was a very stubborn man.
Now he's publicly given him two fingers. Really, this marks the beginning of the end for Roger.
Just over 2 weeks later, more mysterious men came for Roger. And it seems it wasn't long before interrogation turned to torture. Over several days, Roger said he was repeatedly burnt with cigarettes. He was beaten. And electrocuted. Eventually, Roger claimed he signed an affidavit stating Marcos had nothing to do with the theft of his Buddha, and revealed the location of the thousands of gold ingots.
Roger was a very broken man when he signed that affidavit. I mean, there he was fighting publicly, but now admitting that no, there was no wrongdoing. He must have been completely demoralized.
Marcos had Roger imprisoned and wasted no time helping himself to the rest of Roger's find. But eventually, Marcos's megalomania would prove his undoing. In 1986, a popular revolution forced Marcos and Imelda to flee the country. The Filipino people stormed Marcos's presidential palace, and what they found inside was unbelievable.
They were amazed at what they found. They found treasures of statues and art and thousands of pairs of shoes. This is just what they left behind.
Marcos was by far and away the wealthiest man alive.
They were so wealthy, they didn't really know what to do with their money.
One of the questions for the Filipino people was, where had the Marcoses' enormous wealth come from? For most, there was an obvious answer.
Marcos's wealth primarily came from theft, embezzlement, and corruption. And you can look back, I think, on their joint reign as simply being a plot of self-enrichment. And the administration of the Philippines was merely a secondary item.
They were basically using the public treasury as their piggy bank.
Years later, while on trial for fraud and embezzlement, Imelda Marcos's defense declared their fortune was not looted from the Philippine treasury, but actually came from finding Yamashita's gold.
I think Imelda claimed that their joint wealth came primarily from finding Yamashita's gold because it was a very good blind. Nobody could prove otherwise. Yamashita's gold was just a wonderful alibi.
But for Roger Rojas, none of this mattered. His life was in ruins.
Roger never fully recovered from his torture. And the damage is so great that he can't see out of his right eye for the rest of his life after this. He's lost his money, he's lost his self-respect, he's lost his wife. Roger has lost everything.
Despite all this, Roger still had a bit of the spirit that had helped him find the gold.
It's a treasure hunter's mentality. They must get to the end of the story. They must get the treasure. Anyway, Roger had lost so much. He had nothing to lose.
With Marcos in exile in Hawaii, Roger filed a lawsuit against him. Even when Marcos died 1 year later, in September 1989, the case continued.
You could say that the Marcoses actually got away with it. He went out, lived his exile in Hawaii, and died of natural causes. You could well say that they did rather well out of it.
It would take a further 7 years before Roger was at last vindicated. In 1996, the jury concluded Marcos had stolen Roger's find. $43 billion in damages were awarded.
When the court finds in Roger's favor, it's a significant moment in legal history. $43 billion is awarded to Roger, which is the biggest civil lawsuit award in history.
Sadly, Roger never saw justice done. On the eve of his day in court, he died. He was just 49 years old. Then, in 1998, the huge compensation award was overturned. While no court has challenged the verdict that Marcos stole Roger's treasure, how to determine its value is still being fought out by the lawyers.
It's hard not to look back at Roger and feel empathy for this man. His determination was boundless. And I think, if nothing else, Roger was a hero. And I think that's how he's going to be remembered.
He was willing to be David against Goliath. He was willing to put his life on the line, and therefore my hat off to him.
Roger's tragic story begs the question: was what he found a one-off? Or, as the legend states, are there another 174 treasure vaults still waiting to be discovered? Since the war, treasure hunters from across the world have scoured the Philippines in search of Yamashita's gold. Yet none of them have found anything. Nonetheless, people are still willing to risk their lives looking.
Searching for Yamashita's gold is a very dangerous activity. Even to this day, I think it was in 2000, 2 men were buried alive looking for treasure.
What drives them is their certainty that Yamashita's gold is still out there.
The legend of Yamashita's gold in the Philippines is huge, and it hasn't died.
It endures because it's real, because there really are burial sites. There really is gold bars, gold dishes, gold treasures that are still to be found in the islands of the Philippines.